Our scripture reading this morning comes from Luke 9, verses 28 through 36. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up onto the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. Suddenly, they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking about his exodus, which he was about to fulfill in Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but as they awoke, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us set up 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not realizing what he was saying. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent in those days, told no one any of these things they had seen. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Today is Transfiguration Sunday, which is always the Sunday before Ash Wednesday. It is the story where Jesus with his disciples is truly shining, is most enlightened, and confirmed as God's own Son, the Messiah. This is one of the essential mountaintop stories in the whole scriptures, but also the New Testament. And at this time is also where there is no more guessing who Jesus is. The light of God spotlights Jesus for his disciples to see who they are following. Now we can look at Transfiguration also through the lens of leaders. It is a story about the different leaders. All on that mountaintop become great leaders of the faithful. Even Peter, who gives us a great example of getting it wrong, he eventually becomes the leader that baptizes the Gentiles and welcomes many into our faith. This story is special because Jesus meets with the other great spiritual leaders of the Israelite people. He is talking with Moses, the lawgiver, who saw God face to face and lived. Moses is also the one who kind of kicked off this whole meeting God on the mountain thing. It started with the burning bush. He gave the 10 commandments at Mount Sinai, and he gives his last speech on the mountain telling the Israelite people when they go into the promised land to choose life. Now Elijah gives us another type of mountaintop experience. Elijah, when he has his mountaintop experience, is afraid. He is hopeless. He is hunted by King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, and he escapes to the mountain of God where he finally just collapses and says, "I am done." And God appears in the silence, not in the earthquake, not in the storm, not in the fire, but in silence. God meets Elijah and tells him, yes, you can retire. Take a nap first. Then you have to pass the mantle to your successor. Your time is done. In Jesus' mountaintop experience, he has some company. Like I said, he is talking with Moses and Elijah. He also has kind of these 3 disciples in tow to witness. This is Peter, James, and John. And most importantly, we have God step in and deliver a message that sets Jesus into another category of leadership. Now, leadership is important. And we tend to remember our leaders. We tend to honor them in kind of weird ways. Evidently, in the 1930s, people needed to work, and so we just kind of put several presidents on a mountain in South Dakota, and we called it Mount Rushmore. If you go to the National Mall, there seem to be little nooks and crannies, not to mention the National Portrait Gallery, where we have a kind of memorials or the names of our leaders and where we honor them. We also tend to do this in churches as well. In fact, our congregation is a bit of an outlier. We're a bit outside of the norm because about every other church has kind of somewhere, usually in the fellowship hall or maybe in the back of the sanctuary, kind of the portrait gallery where there are many pastors. In fact, at one church, when I was joking and I was leaving as their longest tenured pastor in over about 20 years, and I'd only been there for about 3.5 years, and saying, "Hey, you got a good picture for me up there?" And she said, "Well, John, every other pastor there had been 20 or 10 years as pastor." And said, "I don't think you stayed long enough for that." But sometimes it's also kind of interesting how we interpret that. I remember visiting my friend Erin. We were taking a tour of her church. We were in a first call group as a pastors. And she said, as we went downstairs in kind of her urban St. Louis church, she commented that she didn't kind of like the old men in the fellowship hall. And then we turn the corner and we see this long row of men, pastors, almost all of them in black and white. And I remember looking, and unfortunately, as kind of sometimes you do, the Presbyterian church is pretty small, so it's actually one of those weird things. I actually recognized one of the guys, and so I walked up there, and I was just like, "How could you not like Dr. Smiley's dad?" And Aaron was sitting there, kind of jaw dropped, and at first I thought it was like, "Hey, maybe it's because we're a small enough Presbyterian world that you actually knew it." And then I realized she had kind of dropped her jaw because now I was on her bad side. Which was funny because in reality, one of those pictures from the early 1900s, over 100 years before the date we were sitting there, was the father of one of my seminary professors who recommended the book Elmer Gantry to me by Sinclair Lewis. Now, Elmer Gantry is a novel. It is also a warning about how we should be careful when choosing our church leaders. The novel follows kind of this guy as he journeys through kind of the Baptist denomination. He becomes an evangelist. He eventually kind of settles down and becomes a Methodist preacher. But the interesting as this kind of book follows Elmer Gantry, we start to notice that he did not pay attention to the parts of the Bible that said, "Do not steal, do not commit adultery." But he preached powerful sermons about sin, which was from his own experience. I don't know if his parishioners knew that. But he was also narcissistic, and the book kind of follows the downfall and the ills of the 20th century culture. And we're to be reminded of that as our PNC will be asking questions on our behalf of our next leader, like, where were you during the pandemic? What is your leadership style? How many churches have a picture of you in their fellowship hall? And also you can say, share your mountaintop experience. And especially us who are common and know what it's like to be on the mountaintop, those will be very important questions. We also have to be careful not to follow into the same problem that faces Peter. Peter, as mentioned, steps in it. We have done that before up in the high country, not too far away from a cattle guard. But he tends to step in it when it comes to church buildings. He is sitting there and wants to enshrine that moment where Jesus, Moses, and Elijah, and he sits there and says, "Well, why don't we create 3 little shrines?" And all the people sitting there, and it's just like, dude, not the time, not the moment. But we tend to also be like Peter. Church buildings become shrines rather than places of worship. And we saw kind of a demonstration of this a few years ago. We may remember when Notre Dame in Paris caught fire during before the pandemic. And it was a shock, It was kind of one of those things. Maybe you were up late at night, or maybe you caught the news later, and you saw this world-renowned landmark, maybe something you had to do a project on in foreign language class, or if you took kind of French 101, you would always talk about Notre Dame, but it burnt down in just a single moment, a single night. And it was interesting to see also in kind of post-Christian Europe, European capital, how quickly the funds were raised, how quickly it was rebuilt. Meanwhile, at kind of the same time that this was happening, where they were able to kind of rally around and do all this, many of the people were realizing that, like kind of the institutions in the Western world, they were built during kind of the Christian era, were not working as well in the post-Christian world. One of our recent convert was talking about this at a conference. And she was talking about now that she has lived in the West, because she came here from Africa, now that she had converted to Christianity, having spent some time as kind of an atheist, now that she was operating a Christian operating system, it seemed that she fully understood how all the applications or apps were working properly. And at this conference, she was getting up and saying, I just wish everybody would update their operating system and kind of re-Christianize Europe. In many ways, this illustrates a difficulty with the church at large. Like Peter, we love physical places to house our sacred memories, but they always fall short of the true experience of faith. Even the people on that mountaintop were looking at Peter and said, you cannot capture this. You cannot fully embody this if you make a shrine, but you just have to be here in the moment and see what is happening. We fall short because that true experience of God is really something that we can't just put in to words. The mistake we make today is sometimes we confuse a church building with the church as the people of God. The experiences we have with the people of God will always be more pressing, more longer standing than the buildings in which we experience them. This day, though, on Transfiguration Sunday, we see a true experience. And oddly enough, what I think is funny about this kind of text, especially in Luke, and it goes through Matthew and Mark as well, is at that time the disciples did not share that message. They did not share that mountaintop experience. And sometimes it is hard for us to share our faith. I remember a minister who had just retired 40 years was saying that, for the last 20 years, almost half of the time in which I had served the church, we as a denomination have not known that the world is changing, that we have also kind of recognized that, but we have also not really done that as well. He said for the last 20 years, we know that it requires us to share our faith rather than just putting the times for worship on our board, on our sign outside of the church. And he said in the last 20 years, it is hard, especially for us Presbyterians, we have been struggling. Yet it can be very personal to tell our faith stories. Perhaps it is hard to put into word. Yet when we do it, some of the most meaningful stories involves an experience that bolsters not only our faith, but the faith of those around us. One of the experiences I have had the last few years as a pastor in my ministry is the joy of going to the deacons meeting. As a pastor, I'm not on the board of deacons. It's also great to go to a meeting where people don't look at me and I'm not in charge, and that's always kind of a great experience as well. But it's also great to sit there because you can hear the stories about how the deacons and their ministry touched the lives of those around us. I have heard how a visit from a deacon could touch and influence somebody's life. It could be as simple as visiting a sick daughter or stopping by the hospital after a procedure. Some may share how in a moment of grief they received a simple act of kindness, whether that is dropping off a casserole, or perhaps they have found support after a broken relationship. We found a new lease on life, or perhaps just visit from a friend can lift our spirits. And sometimes I have heard that people have received help from the deacons when they thought no one cared. Now, these are just small kind of everyday sharings. These are small everyday examples, strategically on the Sunday before the deacons meeting, and also when we will be making blessing bags today. Yet they are part of our experience of faith. And I think, especially in the moments where we are together, that we have an opportunity to share those experiences. As we wind down, though, let us remember also that the disciples found the right time to disclose the faith experience on that mountaintop. Perhaps during the season of Lent, we might share some experiences around the fellowship table. Maybe at a time of fellowship after church that we have almost every Sunday, we can use that as an opportunity as well. We will also be sharing some Lenten meals in the next coming weeks. And perhaps maybe in kind of the intimacy of a book study or Bible study, that is a good opportunity to share our faith as well. But we do know that when the time is right, that we can tell our story. That we know that sometimes our role, and ones that Presbyterians are very good at, is sitting quietly and listening to other people's stories. But we know that our stories and the story of Christ is important. It can change our lives and show us a new way. And for that, we can be very thankful.